I'm Rich Fisher. I'm, like I said, the North American manager for cultural projects. I'm going to keep my bio short for my much more accomplished and well-spoken colleagues here on this round table. As we think about the question, the theme for today, I'm going to start off with you, Brian. Perception in museums, architecture, light, and the visitor experience, and some of the work that you are doing and you have done with WHY and at the Met and other institutions. I'm curious just your overall feeling when you hear that phrase, where you start.
So I think I first start questioning what type of perception. So, obviously we're here today to talk about lighting. I don't think you can separate lighting from other forms of perception in any human experience. And with the museum, I think what we're seeing is a move towards acknowledging full sensory experiences. And so that can be, I think, more discussion about the role of lighting in shaping visitor comfort. I think there's a lot more awareness about how acoustics and sound signatures of rooms also shape visitor comfort. What makes us feel comfortable versus a feeling of anxiety, or in a museum, sometimes a feeling of insecurity. If you don't necessarily understand contemporary art, or if, you may walk into a gallery and have a perception that it is overly art historical. And so you might feel that it's not for you from an intellectual standpoint. I think that light, sound, all of these, aspects of sort of human senses, but essentially aspects of perception, play a huge role in one's enjoyment of that experience, in one's feeling of, wanting to continue with that experience into other spaces versus backtrack and think maybe this isn't for me. I also think that an understanding of perception and how these things play a role in museum design really open up new ways for museums to speak to new audiences, ones that might be looking for broader experiences in the museum than just a traditional gallery experience. And that, I think we as designers need to not shy away from having that conversation and see those things as design criteria, really. And, it's not just about sort of that intuitive perception. I think that all of these things today, we have ways of measuring them. We have data collection. We have an understanding of things like light levels and acoustic levels, but also the different qualities of those sensations that really can be used as a design tool. So, for me, I think the short version would be, I have a lot to say that could go a lot of different directions when I hear the term perception in museums. But, I think specifically to lighting, it's really what role it can play in that more comprehensive experience of a space.
Yeah, thank you. Thomas, I'm going to ask sort of the same of you. When you hear perceptions in museums, architecture, light, you've spoken regularly, you've written articles, published on the role of light in architecture. Where do you start from in that, or where do you see that playing out?
I think it starts for me with a story, what the museum or the curator would like to convey as a main message, and then trying to translate this into a visitor experience. Of course, you have the configuration of the specific museum, the space there, and then using light to facilitate this experience there, either to come down, to focus, to concentrate, to generate maybe a night atmosphere if the topic of the exhibition is about specific topics there, or maybe to make it more fascinating as some kind of entertainment factor, so to attract maybe the young generation, that you have some kind of photogenesis settings there where you say, oh, that's a very nice perspective which you would like to capture and then share with your online community. And there the museum has also the possibility for communication and branding there. So this is something what I regard as very interesting, and to look how you can light influences with various ways of dramatic settings, of light beams, of lighting directions, maybe even dynamic lighting there. So while going through an exhibition, you have different kind of atmospheres, or when it's a different kind of exhibition, to calm down, and when there are a lot of artifacts there in the room, really to have a calm setting for comparison there when this is an important topic for perceiving the art. And so this is something where I think that this is an important role, and light is really quite flexible. If you would like to rearrange an exhibition from one setting to the next one, and you can easily change this without really starting very large painting jobs, for example, in the exhibition space.
Yeah, Brian, you made a comment last night when we were talking about light not being as expensive as walls, which is an interesting sort of jumping off point or just phrase for Thomas, what you had just shared. I'm interested, Thomas, you know, you do a lot of writing. We had a conversation this morning sort of on this theme of, you know, vertical illumination and framing, and how, you know, maybe from a very technical starting point, and we'll move between these sort of maybe very specific and broad sort of elements in this discussion of how you utilize those in museum spaces to tell those different stories.
Yes, there's a wide variety. So it's really start with the perception. What do we would like to have? So if we would like to have a very intense focus, like behind you, for example, there with the explicit framing there, the sunset looks very nice, but really this is emphasized there. If it should be a little bit softer, then we have the spotlight next to you, or if it should be really very calm, then we start with the wall washing approach there. And of course, we have the freedom to combine these elements there, so to come up with more drama or less drama. But always the question, do we really want to notice the lighting effect, or is it about the overall experience? So some curators and scenographers really play with the topic. You would like to have the artworks stand out as individuals hanging there, popping maybe out to your eyes there. And then, of course, you would go more to a very dedicated framing approach, or you can play the very subtle way that you use maybe framing, but you hardly see this. So recently I was in Berlin in an exhibition where you could see the painted walls were wall washed, and then a very soft framing which was used, but hardly any visitor would experience this there. So this is, I think, the very elegant form of slide emphasize, but without giving too much punch to an art piece where you say, oh, this is a lot of too much drama for this impressionist painting.
Yeah. I think, Brian, as I think through that as well as, you know, former lighting designers now in the realm we're in, and that collaboration with the architecture team, of managing that story and thinking about that story as you approach a project. And I've been lucky enough to see and be in the spaces of a number of your projects. You know, I've read a fair amount about Rockefeller, the Rockefeller wing, and seen some of those photos. One of the things I'm always really intrigued by and why projects is the use of daylight. I think Speed Art Museum is a really great and strong use of that. And I look forward to seeing Rockefeller in person, but knowing some of the history. I'm curious how you balance that in an architectural perspective. Just going to keep using the perspective word, but from an architectural viewpoint, how do you balance those and start with that from a programmatic perspective on your side?
So I think if you look at the history of museums from sort of modernism to today, everyone would agree that some of their favorite museums are beautifully daylit museums. And at some point along the way, you know, collection care standards, conservation standards for light levels, we, you know, generally as an industry moved away from daylit galleries for light sensitive fine art collections, understandably. But I think we also lost the quality of daylight in that museum going experience that, you know, really, I think makes for, you know, back to the word perception, a sort of variation in your experience and a connection actually outside to the landscape, gives you a sense of place. I think you understand a sense of time better. And so with our work, I think we're trying to bring natural light back into these gallery environments. The glazing technology of today and, you know, other light mitigation efforts exist now that I think we can have that conversation through our design work. So, you know, using frits and films and new, you know, insulated glazing units with different gases and inner layers, we can achieve, light level mitigation to a level that we couldn't. And a lot of our projects are replacing glazing systems from 20, 30 years ago or more. So that sophistication allows for much more daylight within the galleries. But I also think being really sensitive about what work goes in those daylit areas. So, yes, at the speed, a lot at the Harvard Art Museums, the work we did there, and certainly at the Met, if you can do exhibition design and exhibition lighting design earlier in the process where the actual art objects themselves can inform things like curtain wall design, glazing replacements, you can be strategic about bringing natural light into the gallery environment. So I think the Met project does that very successfully. And it's definitely a belt and suspenders approach. There's also motorized shades on sensors that are tied into, the building management system that, hopefully will only be up 19, 20, 25% of the time, as opposed to the previous condition where they were down 100% of the time. Right. So you also, I think, now can look at things in terms of a calendar year. So instead of it just being, we can't exceed this light level, what's your cumulative annual lux? How do we actually use all the sophisticated daylight modeling software we have now to really understand the cumulative annual exposure on that work of art in that particular location, and understand that instead of that changing an architectural strategy that would, prohibit daylight in the gallery, it might mean that we actually can shift all those objects around, sometimes even as little as 6 inches to a foot, and get to a place that is acceptable in terms of that cumulative annual lux exposure. So I think if you just approach the problem holistically from the beginning, you also have to convince your clients to pay for your lighting designers and the daylighting studies earlier in the process. But if you can do that, you can have a comprehensive approach from the beginning. It opens up all kinds of avenues for, both art placement and daylight in the galleries. And then, like you said, you can also build less walls. A lot of times in galleries, you build walls to block light when you have windows. I think you can actually think of light strategically and, object placement and, in a lot of times create similar effects, allow for that daylight, allow for a more open presentation of the objects as well. And we now have the tools to be more sophisticated about that.
Yeah. One of the things I read in the last week or so with the Rockefeller Wing opening is this diagonal cut sort of of the three oceanic.
Yeah.
Apologize for it, but that there is, and you spoke about it in this interview I read, and I'd love you to touch on it a little bit, just so that way I don't have to send out and find that article and send it to everybody. You're all welcome to connect with Brian or Thomas or myself on LinkedIn and see these too. But I just found it really interesting the way you talked about it and the framing of the sort of three collections and how that helped with the visitor path and movement, not just light perspective.
Certainly. So I think the most important thing there to acknowledge, and hopefully we do that in our work with our lighting designers, is the role light plays in visitor flow and movement. Those of you that are lighting designers, I'm sure know this intrinsically, but it's not always talked about in the context of visitor flow and movement in these gallery projects. So with the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, it was the collections of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. The Americas were the most light sensitive objects, or the oceanic objects were the most light sensitive objects, and they occupied the third of the gallery against the windows. So that obviously was prohibiting.
Becomes a big challenge.
It was a huge challenge. However, those also are the largest objects requiring the tallest ceiling height. So we couldn't move the entirety of that oceanic collection away from the windows. However, we could move about 2/3 of it. The way the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing section works is there's two double height spaces on either side, to the north and the south, and then the central third bay is much lower ceilings because there's mezzanine offices above. So knowing that the lighting conditions in the space before we renovated it were not ideal in terms of daylight, but they also weren't ideal in terms of, electric light either, because you had these different ceiling conditions and the collections had all been more or less presented without any context of that ceiling height. So you had objects with very tall ceilings being lit from the ceiling, and they actually had to drop in a grid, that hung about 12 feet down. So that created this huge architectural element overhead that really distracted from your experience of those art objects. But they had to do that to light, but at that time was predominantly the African collection. The lower ceiling heights also had not ideal lighting conditions. And then the use of color in the space also wasn't helping, in that it was overly didactic, where you had sort of yellows and browns for Africa, blue for Oceania. And, that of course has a lighting impact on the works themselves. And so what we wanted to do was move away from that type of presentation, more contemporary, more clean, in a way recede and go away as much as we can as designers, to let the objects, really be shown in their best light. And the diagonal, conveniently it's Oceania, so it's an archipelago. It can have kind of a more meandering shape to it, or at least that works as a metaphor. But really what it was allowing us to move half the collection to the other double height space, and then we had to connect them on a diagonal. The diagonal created a much more interesting view, actually, to Central Park, in contrast to the perpendicular views that we'd set up, where we allow that view to Central Park, but with glazing, we actually don't let the visitor pass through except at controlled points. So that aids in the storytelling, the sort of narrative of the galleries, and the desired flow of the gallery. So you can always see Central Park on that kind of north-south axis. So that light draws you to the windows, and you go actually find those collections. Before, many people didn't get to that part of the museum because it wasn't super intuitive to get there. And then the diagonal, which is actually the visitor circulation path, is, sort of not in opposition to that perpendicular axis, but I think is reinforced as a circulation path. And, obviously signage and wayfinding work, but really the lighting and the objects on both ends as anchors draw you through that diagonal.
Yeah.
And it also allowed for clear distinctions then between those three collections, which together represent 3/5 of the world or something like that. So, there's many distinctions even within those blocks. And I think, throughout all of this process of, organizing the galleries in terms of sort of the interpretation plan for the collections, the visitor flow, thinking about security, thinking about equipment movement, all of that, the role of lighting, and especially these views to Central Park and the role of daylighting, played a huge role.
Yeah, I love you talking about sort of the use of lighting and the views that are created, helping, like you said, draw people through it. And right, maybe the lighting people will always argue, and as a former lighting designer, we'd always say, like, if you're in the dark, we can't hear you, sort of a thing. Maybe that was to help the lighting designers work better. We'd make you go find your light. But it is a really interesting topic of light as wayfinding, using that, drawing people through variation of intensity. And I know, Thomas, one thing I have always appreciated about your work, especially within ERCO, is sort of the understanding of the history of light and its use in architectural spaces, and the evolution of it. I'm curious, as sort of hearing Brian talk about that and the resistance of daylight and this change of that. What do you see as sort of maybe where we're at in styles or thematic uses of lighting, or do you see that shifting with the new LED technology, people more open to experimenting or resorting back to basics? Where do you think?
Definitely there are new opportunities there. Of course, there's not a special trend, because a variety of architects and designers thinking about either allowing daylight or excluding it, and depending on the artifacts there, if it's sculptures or sensitive artwork there. So I think there's no very specific trend there. But we could see that with LED technology, especially the aspect of miniaturization is there. So luminaires become much more invisible, elegantly hidden in the ceiling or somewhere else, ceiling channels. Opportunities, they're getting smaller. So in display cases, you hardly see the luminaires anymore. So this makes it more elegant, and you can focus much more on the artwork than on some kind of lighting technical infrastructure there to perceive fine arts. And I think the biggest change came with the possibility to work on different light colors. So in former times, you just had the very warm tungsten light. But with LED lighting, we have the full flexibility and allowing gallery spaces which are temporarily maybe allowing more daylight in there to adjust the lighting of the fixtures for daylight. And maybe when there's a temporary exhibition, there's a need for bringing the daylight, keeping the daylight out, then we can go maybe to a more warm white color there. And this flexibility in former times meant either using many filters on your fixtures or getting other fixtures there. But today you can just control this with software when you have the tunable white technology and you're very flexible. And even during the course of the daytime, you could think about an atrium space, for example. At daytime, it's much more harmonic to have a coolish light with a blue sky above you. And for the evening, the same light color would look kind of strange there. So you can work with a very slow shift there of the color temperature over a couple of minutes, so hardly any visitor will experience this. But for the evening walk there or winter visit, for example, then it just feels very natural to have the warmer lights there. And this is flexibility which was not available there before. And the other features are that you can easily control dimming light levels very simply. And so before, I think it was more thought of how much effort it is to change actually the design. But today it's much more flexible. And in the evening, for yesterday, we talked about special events. If the museum thinks about some branding or corporate events, you would like to just change this and convert the same exhibition space into more a stage-like atmosphere there with much more drama for the centerpiece, but still having a very good color rendition for the artwork in the background, and to balance this, that you have a very photogenic social media style overall impression, but at other times it's much more subdued there and concentrated there. And this flexibility with tools, maybe for the specific section, then for RGBY technology, adjusting this is something which is quite interesting. Or even when you have some artworks, you can partly work on illuminating it warmer or cooler. Then, of course, you start to interpret the artwork, and some curators are a little bit sensitive about this. But if you do it in a very subtle way, it can lead to a very interesting experience and can compensate sometimes maybe faded artwork over the time there because daylight was too intense for the past.
Yeah, it's interesting, that dynamic element that you're talking about. I find it really interesting, and influencing the artwork or things like that. I often think when I go to museums and we demonstrate this or talk about it, you could certainly do that if we're mimicking daylight, if there is a really well controlled and managed daylight system, and if you kind of buy into that. But the other thing I think is really interesting from as we think about perspectives, is the perspective of what the museum is intending to do is changing. I feel like that as I travel and you go to conferences, it's a thing we hear about quite a lot. Sure, revenue events and evening events and things like that, but also as a place for the community. We know obviously the educational outreach of museums is so strong, and I often think about the ability to have a conversation about what is a rose? Is a rose the red, or is it the and what is the work supposed to look like? And like you said, I am not a curator, and I'm not a sort of that is not my background, but I find it really interesting to be able to think about creating moments within a museum, whether that's physical, a combination of having physical space to allow to gather, but also the flexibility and the tools to shape and create within a piece of art and say, this is how it looks. Do you think it's better when it's lit like this? What do you see when it's lit like this versus that? And we so often do that when we demonstrate with a museum staff to make a selection, but certainly could be part of a toolkit of that, and how we think about the most famous pieces of art, or the first time we're experiencing something, and how different it could be. It's a tricky one within that.
It is tricky, and I think that conversation can be approached, in a unique way related to every art collection or every artwork. So a lot of the artworks in a museum, especially a place like the Met, the majority of those were not produced with a sort of intended lighting in mind when they were made. Now, contemporary art, modern contemporary art, certainly, especially from the 80s onward, you have works of art that are absolutely produced with the idea of how they'll be lit and how they'll be seen in a gallery context. So, and of course now with digital art and, even just sort of film, digital media, moving image, et cetera, there are very particular ideas about the role of light and sound in the presentation of those works in a gallery or a museum context. So I think that the most important thing is just to have that conversation. At the Nelson Atkins Museum, they're using dynamic LEDs to, in its normal presentation in the context, show a few works by Monet as they would be presented in a museum, but with dynamic lighting, they can also show how it may have appeared to Monet when he was painting outside, and with the exact lighting effects from the south of France where this, painting would have been produced. So I think that there are interesting things you can do with that. I mean, that's just one example. I think museums can certainly think about this as a way to tell stories both about the art, the artist, the production of the work itself. But in terms of dynamic lighting, I also think, and this is getting to what Thomas was saying about special events and other activities at night and the use of color, I think all museums are moving towards more hybrid use in their spaces. So it used to be that, galleries were galleries and they were secure environments and they were never used for events or, board meetings, and you can't bring in any food and all of that. Most of that is still true, but I think there's a greater appetite for thinking about gallery spaces for places of performance, places of dialogue, concerts, lectures, obviously still with the safety of the art in mind. But I think as designers, we have to design for that increased flexibility, the increased sort of flexible use. That does, of course, have an impact on earned revenue. It's been great with this project at the Met that just opened last week to see all the live art performances from the various cultures around the world that are represented in those galleries. The Met absolutely plans to continue that. So designing in spaces for that to happen, which means more clear floor area. But it also means equipping your galleries with the proper, lighting and audio equipment.
I was going to say, even beyond lighting, just power and connections. And
so and I think museums that are successful on the earned revenue front are museums who have learned how to use all their spaces to think of earned revenue, campus wide as an ecosystem of spaces you can do different events. So it's sort of this movable feast throughout the museum that allows, all of those spaces to have a life beyond just your normal gallery open hours. Right. So I think also in terms of time scale, and this absolutely relates to lighting, every space we touch in a museum, we have to think about 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, what's happening in that space when, or what could happen in that space and when, and what infrastructure needs like lighting do you need to facilitate all those different things that can happen. And so that's, I think, very exciting to not think of these museums in such a static way from a planning perspective.
Right. Thomas, you hit the third rail of dynamic, and now I just want to explore it constantly because I'm from a theater background or other of that. Your doctoral work, your research, all of your writing, you speak about media facades and all of the role light plays on that. I'm curious if you could touch just at a very high level of how color shifting, how that works within the human eye, for lack of a better phrase. And I know that's not maybe your full specialty, but why there's been resistance or what the challenges are and what is it that a museum professional or designer has to consider as well before going too far with it, perhaps.
First is looking into the quality, what you would like to get there, what's the message there. So if you would like to entertain maybe some sponsors, then it's a different setting than if you would like to invite another group there. And so that's very important to think, this is a very short event, so you can work with more intensive colors. But for the daily use of galleries, I would not go into the field of working a lot of theater stage lighting effects there, because this is the distraction. If you think about a short 2-hour event in a museum, it should really be a kind of immersive experience there. And this allows you to show the space, to make an experience there, either with a nocturnal atmosphere of some stars, blue light in the background. And it's not so important to see the nuances of the Night Watch, for example, or other paintings of there, and finding the right balance there. And the question is, will there be some other events? Will there be an important speech? Is the lighting just maybe something in the background? And so you have to balance this for the overall event there, not thinking, oh, the light is the most important. Then it will be very tricky and people will be felt annoyed by the changing light scenes there. So if this is something like a backdrop there for the major event, because there's an important keynote, then light just should provide the very nice background illumination there. And it could be very often we are used from advertisement, very quick changes of color, but it could be a very soft change within half an hour from the beginning of the speech to the end, and thereby you can open in the cocktail reception with a different light mode, but hardly people will receive this. And then you see you have the dynamics, but without, oh, they try to do something really very intense there. And I think this is something of the qualities to think about what you would like to achieve. And other times when you would like to attract maybe kids, you maybe don't need color, but dynamic lighting that some artworks emphasized for educational purposes and brought up into a relationship. It's a small art piece over there with the other one in the background, and then no color is necessary. So there are alternatives when you think about dynamic lighting. It's not about you switch from red, green to blue one. It could be also very much pastel colors, or neglecting any colors, but think about brighteners. And we even have the possibilities when you think about luminous ceilings and accent lighting to play with this drama of very soft light, like a cloudy day, and then you have a more calm impression, or a little bit more drama with accent lighting. So it's not only the color wheel, what we have, it's also the type of lighting, from very strong, harsh accent lighting, grazing light, shadow effects, which you can reveal or brings this down there. And this is something what we could use, and even combine these elements, maybe some pastel colors, a little bit contrast to kind of beams, and then diffuse and directed light there. So there are many possibilities, but very often the first idea of some people go, oh, just we take the color wheel. Of course, it's very easy. You have intense photos on social media for this, click, click, and click. But it's about the visitor experience. What is the main role of the event there, for example?
Right. You mentioned transitions, and that is something that I know we talked about a little bit last night, and it is one commonly comes up in the lighting community for all spaces, not just museums. Not only in an event and using a transition to help pull focus, but also to help that visitor experience, to help it not be so jarring, to not be so exhausting. Museum fatigue, it can be very much a thing when you have high contrast, whether that's from artwork to artwork or space to space, and very disconcerting for visitors. Maybe they just don't think that gallery's open. It could be so dark next to one so bright. That's a real example, unfortunately. When we think about contrast and adaptation, you've talked about whether it's daylight, whether it's that, what are the rules of thumb you like to use to help on your own projects, or if you're giving somebody some advice, you're helping to manage that, whether it's time or distance, from a 10 to a 2, if you think about a very broad white box space to a dark high accent space. When you're helping figure out those spaces, I'm curious from a lighting perspective, and then Brian, I'm going to ask you, like, from an architectural perspective, how you like to solve those. What do you focus on time? Do you just focus on having a medium step? What do you like to utilize to do that, or help guide people to avoid full to dark really quickly in architectural spaces?
So first of all, it really starts with the surface colors and the artwork. How intense is the contrast there? And shall we just slightly emphasize this, or take another level on this, and being there, they're very flexible there. And so it's another time, it's the storytelling where I'm asking what you would like to achieve there. regarding contrast there? Is it more about an overview, the holistic view you would like to have? So it's more the uniformity of various artworks, maybe in one wall, and a different section could play with a richer contrast when there are statues in the space there. And then start from the individual artwork and the room there, but then also linking this room to the next one when you go through an exhibition which consists of several rooms there, to link this, and that it's not maybe fragments there, but you see a continuous line there, and that this combines there. So looking at the proportion of the artwork in the space, the colors which are there, and then recommending to which kind of contrast or uniformity which would work there as well, and finding out the ideas from the artist, how they used it, how they used light in their artwork with rich contrast there, and then the curator perspective, what's the story there of comparison of a very analytical perspective, or should it be more entertaining for a factor to attract visitors? Maybe for the first opening room of an exhibition, you may do maybe something more to draw people in, and then you can reflect the one or other aspect in a different mode.
Yeah. How do you handle that challenge, right? Because, space is at a premium. We already talked about open space for events, which is, a challenge. I'm sure any museum staff member on this or owner's rep is trying to figure out how to find square footage to sort of allocate for that. But from an architecture perspective, making these transitions, like you said, of high to low ceilings or bright daylit to spaces where conservation and low light levels are needed. What are one of the strategies maybe you rely on?
Well, I think, variation, if done properly, is a real asset in terms of design sensibilities and making someone really pay attention to their experience, right? So I think one principle we have in our projects is to encourage active looking, or active experience, not just a passive experience. So things like expansion and compression, your lower ceiling heights, changes in light levels, audio components. These are all things that I think make you stop, think about the experience you're having, look around, pay attention. It makes you an active participant in that experience and in that spatial condition. I think with specifically in terms of light levels, it's not just coming from a daylit space into a, potentially a 5 to 10 foot candle space for prints and drawings, which can be really drastic. But you see it more often in museums that transitions from things like elevator lobbies, which have to be brightly lit for, a number of different reasons, to then immediately go into a gallery. Looking at what types of artworks go in galleries adjacent to those spaces so that you can actually gradually knock down light levels as part of the visitor experience. So maybe if there's paintings or contemporary art that can take a higher light level, you put that near those public areas. I think, generally you just have to be mindful of that. But oftentimes you have to design a threshold condition or a lobby, vestibule, gallery. Maybe there's more didactic information in there so that okay, well, from this gallery that is going to be at this light level to this gallery at that light level, I need 2.5 seconds for someone's eyes to adjust. That's going to be 15 feet. You can also put other stuff in that smaller room to hopefully make them linger there a little longer to get to that point. I think most importantly, you just need to have that conversation as part of the design process, and it needs to be given equal weight to other considerations, such as linear feet for, wall space for art or other things like that, because it will, especially like you said, in terms of museum fatigue, if you spend 2 or 3 hours at a museum and you are constantly encountering this situation, it will add to that fatigue. And I think museums are more receptive to hearing that kind of feedback in the design process now as well. We just need to make sure that we're surfacing that conversation.
Yeah. I want to leave a couple of minutes. We have 10, 12 minutes left here for questions. So please, if you've got a question for the two of them, even me, feel free to throw them in the chat there. One of the things I do want to talk about, maybe is not directly related to the visitor experience, but a general perspective within museums is obviously sustainability. And I do think museum goers are interested in that. Museums are talking about that. We talk about daylight, glass glazing can be a challenge, et cetera. And we also now, I think, more as an issue, don't think of sustainability as a snapshot, moment of time, how much energy we're using, but what does it mean long term over the life of that expansion, renovation, exhibit, et cetera. As you think about it from the lighting side or from the architecture side and sustainability, what are the elements I would say that you're drawing attention to in your projects for the length of an institution? Where are the things you're digging your heels into to say, yes, this is for today, but we really believe in this because of tomorrow and what we don't know even. Thomas.
I think
the
it's
big question. Brian needs was a deep inhale of how much he wants to go into it when I gave him just a few seconds to answer a big question.
For me, it's a combination of durability and adaptability. So we need the infrastructure should work for many years because it's an investment which you would like to have there. But we know there are temporary exhibitions changing very quickly, and even the permanent collections are changing after a specific time. And it would be a pity if you would say, oh, we can't use those fixtures anymore. So technically, they need to last very long. And we see solutions where you have luminaires working for 20 years regarding control gears and LED boards, and the opportunity to update them because you can open the luminaires and make a second generation out of them there. But the most important part is really to think about the flexibility, how you can change the light beam over the time, that they're robust enough that you can orientate them, do something like this. But also the factor that probably the control infrastructure, the control protocol will probably change. And do you have a unit where you can easily update to the latest technology there, and having this openness and interfaces there? That's a way how we think and develop luminaires in the research and development department there for sustainable luminaires. So it's not only thinking about the hard works, the very low carbon footprint, that you will have a green certification for the museum, and then of course using sensors to bring out the energy there. It's really this kind of software factor for the future there, that you're very open to these kind of networks and you can think and consider upgrades.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I would answer that in two ways. One, I think whether it's to meet a client's specific sustainability targets or, 2050 goals, or when do we get to net zero, et cetera. I think that all aspects of the project now are thought of in terms of sustainability, and it's also, material selections, and in a museum context, you also have to be particularly mindful of durability, resiliency, ease of maintenance, all of that stuff, I think, leads to a more sustainable project, regardless of whether it meets lead points, et cetera. I think our goal, because, we're often in a position where we're coming in and redoing galleries that, were very significant projects 20 or 30 years ago. And I think the old model, for the most part, was museums would go gallery by gallery, and pretty much the expectation was any gallery would last about 20, 30 years and then probably have to get redone at that time. So I think the biggest impact we can have on sustainability, in addition, obviously, to thinking about, more sustainable infrastructure, wholesale lighting upgrades throughout an institution, obviously that has a huge long-term impact. But through our design projects, when we are tasked with big capital projects that are millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, how can we really make sure that what we're doing is attempting to create sort of the most, I would say, flexibility, future-proofing, most resiliency, whatever terms you want to apply to it. But the idea is, what's the longevity of the work we're doing? Or is what we're doing flexible enough to anticipate the future gallery needs or future museum needs of a rapidly changing world, rapidly changing technology? Most of the spaces we're renovating today were designed before iPhones existed. things will continue to change that quickly. So I think the most sustainable thing we can do is create spaces that don't also then require that very expensive capital project or renovation, in another 20 years or 30 years. Can we extend that lifetime? Can we ensure that what we do, like, let's say it doesn't anticipate these rapid changes we're all experiencing. If you have to redo it in 10 years, then there's, it doesn't matter how sustainable your material selection was. If the project itself doesn't anticipate the future needs of the museum and has to be redone for that reason, it's not sustainable at all.
Right. Right.
So I think that's the way we approach it mostly is, our best chance at creating a sustainable project is to spend a lot of time listening to our client and really try to understand and anticipate what those needs will be 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Aaron, do we have a few questions? Aaron says we sure do. Thank you all for throwing some in there. We'll try to keep our answers as tight as we can to get through as many as we can.
Why is 3000K still used in museums when 4000K balances the color spectrum better? Or is it just the norm?
Well, I don't know that I would totally agree. So the question was, why is 3000K still the norm if 4000K balances the color spectrum better? I think that is a little bit of the source dependent and perspective dependent, to be honest, from my perspective in answering that. I often do it and I change my own selection based on the factors we have talked about. What is the artwork? What is the daylight? How do I feel that day? What are the feelings? And so I tend to leave that to those at the museum to make the choice of what they feel is the best.
So sometimes we can even see 3500 Kelvin was chosen because the museum didn't really know too much daylight coolish color or very warm light color. So this has been a recent trend which we observed there, that some people think about the compromise and still having very good color rendition there.
Yeah.
So there are various spectra available.
Well, and I think, the key word for this discussion is perception.
Yeah.
So I think, regardless of whether 3500 or 4000 has better color rendering, there's been a perception, or I would say, just it's been the experience of museum professionals for centuries, since the invention of incandescent light, to experience light more in that 2500 to 3000
Correct. Yeah.
color temperature range. So to them, I don't believe it's actually about color rendering. It's about comfort and it's about what they're familiar with. And so if you as a curator have been looking at a masterwork for 20 years of your career at 3000, when you look at it at 4000, it's quite jarring and very uncomfortable and it feels wrong. And so I think, museums, certainly contemporary art, much more comfortable with 3500. Even contemporary art has a very hard time with 4000. But I think that, all of this is probably changing, and ultimately it'll be changed, I think, from artists specifying what color temperature they would like the galleries to use with their artwork.
And I think especially it's interesting to see the color temperature in relation to the brightness levels.
Mm-hmm.
So you can play very nicely with different color temperature, because 100% or 50% or 50 lux, this color temperature looks quite different there. And so we have to really think about what will be the final light levels there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also just think that cooler light temperature we associate more with daylight, right? So it's during the day, especially when have a sort of mixed experience of daylight galleries and not, that color temperature is less problematic than at night, where it feels like you're having, I think it's even at night when the galleries actually feel much more different at that cooler color temperature. And I think that it should be really a discussion about what is that, if that's a more comfortable experience, is it actually one that's more of familiarity and even nostalgia than one of, what's the CRI of this, particular color temperature?
Yeah. Go ahead, Aaron. Great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Perfect. Next one is from Michael. What is the best way to deal with or lead a curator who does not know what Schielke they want or is not familiar with different illumination techniques?
So the question was, in case you can't hear Aaron in the background, what are some strategies or approaches to work with curators that may not know where they want to get, maybe not able to verbalize it? I think often in those challenges, one of the first things I try to do, and Brian, you've mentioned it a few times, is ask questions and try to find a vocabulary that works. I mean, I try obviously visual references from my time as a lighting designer. Do you like this? Do you like that? I may call it this, you may call it that.
Yeah.
We're trying to use reference looks. What are spaces you've been to that you've liked or didn't like? And what was it about? How did it make you feel? Light can be very subjective. It can be very broad and describing it. And we can be saying fuchsia and magenta and be talking about the same color. So I often think, like we've talked about numbers, asking questions, what is the goal? What is that? And trying to give them references to maybe tease out information.
Yeah, for me, it's showing if there's opportunity for mockups to show it, and also to explain the implications when you go for the one approach versus the other one, not only describing what the perception is, but what associations are, implications for the museum visitor experience or for the artworks there. So working with two opposing elements with a very simple language, and maybe sometimes relating this maybe to daylight atmospheres. You would like to have the noon dramatic sunlight coming up, or is it more a soft evening diffuse lighting there? And so this goes back to Richard Kelly with this very simple language. What do you want? 1, 2, 3, what kind of mixture? And then people start, oh, I prefer this with this one in this section. And so this was, I think, one of the success factors from Richard Kelly, just to come with his 3 principles of ambient luminescence, focal glow, and layer of brilliance.
I mean, you introduced daylight into projects, so you have to have a lot of these fun conversations and questions and reassuring on them, but that might be a whole other hour of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you introduce daylight or you introduce, multiple settings, I mean, Thomas had mentioned using dynamic lighting to ensure that that object is lit, if there is a daylight component during the day, at night it's lit, equally well. So the ability to have that throughout the course of a day, to have some variability there is amazing. I think when it comes to communicating with your curator or client, we often have the luxury of being able to take people on field trips to other museums. You don't always have that luxury, since that costs a fair amount of money and coordination. But I think showing, images, and like you said, just coming up with a common vocabulary of, what are we trying to achieve here? And it is kind of the Richard Kelly example. You probably do want to have some guiding principles, because what you don't want is to have that conversation for each and every object in the show.
Yeah.
Right. You need to have an overall sort of scheme for the gallery, a couple guiding principles that you deviate from a little bit to properly light each object, and might require some nuance, but you're not deviating too far so that you're not destroying the overall scheme of the gallery.
There's some homogeny, for lack of
no,
consistency.
And obviously, of course, there can be more dramatic moments, there can be more subtle moments there, I mean, it doesn't mean that it has to be homogeneous necessarily, but establishing those guiding principles, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
Also saves a lot of time, so that you're not going, object by object. And then, as Thomas said, mock-ups, I think, are really, really important. So, even if you have to just do it with a paper printout of the work, having proper facilities to do that, really talking through all of the options. But also, I think, holding time for that conversation, because we all come to these projects from our own areas of expertise, or from what we did last time that we thought worked. And so I think holding time for a longer conversation, multiple conversations throughout the length of the project, where everyone can actually leave their comfort zone and come to a shared place, is really important. And I think a lot of times those conversations don't actually get enough breathing space.
Yeah. We're a little after 1. Are there 2 more questions? We'll try to do those quickly. Let's do it.
More challenging to design for A, static lighting and moving visitors, or B, dynamic lighting and stationary visitors? or C, cannot be compared?
So the
Oh, we go
question,
for C.
the question was, what do we find more challenging? Static visitors with dynamic lighting or static lighting with shifting visitors, or see they cannot be compared? Yeah, it's a tough one.
So recently we see this kind of new trend of projection mapping in very big, large spaces the visitors are sitting, and it's just something like a big TV show or a little bit more experience there, where you have big scenography playing there, but the people are just sitting there. And it requires a lot of, I think, skills and talent to make a very good dramatic, cinematic experience there, and that you sit there for half an hour or even longer, or 15 minutes there, or maybe walk from different perspectives. So this is really something which we see, and then people are maybe surprised, oh, now I would like to see the real Van Gogh or the real Matisse or other work, and then going as a dynamic visitor into a static illuminated exhibition there.
Yeah, I was going to say, if the visitors are static, then the experience is the light or the digital projection, right? The experience is what's not static. And so that's a very different type of experience than a museum where, you want everything to be static. Like, of course you want the visitors to move, but everything. So I think they can't really be compared in that sense. I think they're equally challenging.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the
the
challenge with B, right, is like, there are straightforward design solutions to that. And Brian, you sort of mentioned, is like, in that transitionary space from a bright to dark, you can program it accordingly, or put information that causes them to pause, their eyes to set, and then move on. In a static environment, what I have found, personal experience, is that outside of moving images, types of things, if we're talking a more classical sort of museum environment, especially in an art museum, dynamicism in lighting is challenging to get all parties on board with.
Very.
And I find that, like, from a technical perspective, there's really great designers and really great ways to achieve that. I often think it is making the story authentic and getting everybody's to buy in. So it's two really different challenges from that. So we had one more question. I think we'll try to get through that, and then we'll let everybody go, or everybody's left.
I told my students to join in, and I hope some did. We recently discussed.
Okay, well, Michael's students, if you're here, great work.
Perception is in different cultures. How do you look at this when thinking of museums? Do you notice differences in north, south, east, west?
So the question that was in the chat is, how do we notice the variation of cultural influence around the globe into the projects? I will start. I guess I've started on all the answers, and I apologize for it. But I predominantly deal with the US and Canada. I would say we have some projects in Canada that are more contemporary and have more daylight, and there has been ready acceptance to a cooler source color. And when I have worked internationally as a lighting designer prior to this role, even outside of museums, I would say the same, whether that was the Middle East or Europe on projects, that there wasn't as much resistance to a 4,000 Kelvin or those sorts of sources. And spaces, hospitality spaces, that in North America, especially in the US, we would always consider to say, we want warmth, we want it to feel like, needs to feel like candlelight or something like that, that maybe that was wanted, but not like it had to be. And it was like, yeah, it's fine if that's just the candle in the room is still sort of its thing. I am sure these two can speak much more to that in terms of working around the globe more so than I can in these spaces and what they see. And the culture impacts so much of what is happening in those.
Yeah, I think, inside the galleries, the conversation tends to be more about the best way to light the art. In terms of, in the design process, how we think about how these things would be represented, we absolutely do have that conversation. So, when we were working with the Met, we had conversation about, what are the light qualities of North Africa? you know, where a lot of these objects come from. And we even use the Great Mosque Jenne as one of our architectural references for the project. You know, compare that to light in the South Pacific. Some of these islands that, you know, the various cultures that are in the Oceania collection represent, and what's the light quality there compared to, you know, North America versus Central America, South America, all of which were represented in the Americas. Also, then on top of that, you know, a lot of these objects which were meant to be seen in daylight or would have been seen in daylight versus ones that wouldn't have, that are maybe more ceremonial objects, would have only been seen within certain lodge houses, et cetera. So there's a light component to all of those things that you have to think about. You know, we're also working a fair amount right now in the Middle East and Asia, more with contemporary art collections. But, you know, I think there the consideration is really much more about what we were talking about before, is what is that transition in terms of light levels, even in terms of climactic conditions as you go from outside to inside. You know, as you encounter, you know, actually thinking about the last question, spaces for experiencing the collection versus spaces where you will be a static body in the theater, in the auditorium, you know, potentially in, you know, to see a film, to hear a lecture, maybe even a more immersive space. How do we think about the role of light and climate in its particular context, you know, when thinking about that visitor journey in those transition spaces?
Yeah.
And so with daylight architecture, we could start, there it's a little bit more visible sometimes, I think, in contrast to the electrical lighting, because you have specific window forms, skylights, different shadow systems bring a different light into the space. They're more diffuse or more direct there. So I think there's the differences are visible, and I think especially for the daylight architecture. And then often we have international teams coming not only from the original place, but coming in. And sometimes the scenographer has a very distinct idea about this, and this might influence also the local tradition there, sometimes with full respect to the long history. But I think especially with the original situation, a lot of daylight there. Now moving the object in the museum, the question is, what have we already lost by bringing the artwork from outside into the museum there? So there are many facets to discuss.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and for those that stuck around a little bit extra, I want to thank Brian for all of his time, Thomas for making the long trip, not only for this, but he'll be at Light in San Francisco speaking tomorrow on the evolution of lighting design, or measuring the quality of lighting design.
And the progress of lighting.
The progress of lighting, sorry. So thank you both. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope everybody did as well. And hopefully we'll get to do this all again at some point.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.